Thanks everybody for coming. This is going to be a presentation about ManageIQ for VMware vSphere. Today we are going to cover what's new in vSphere for Darga, for the Darga release, a little bit about what we're going to be doing next for the E-release, and some Q&A, anything VMware related you guys have any questions about. As for me, my name's Adam Grare. I'm a ManageIQ developer and a senior software engineer at Red Hat. I'm on Greg Bloomquist's provider team, and I focus on the VMware vSphere provider. You can IM me, email me, Grare on Gitter, and I'm on there all the time. So, as for what's new in Darga, the VMware provider is probably the oldest in ManageIQ, and so with respect to all the other features, it's really mature and stable, but it's lacking behind a little bit in terms of some of the new things that VMware's added over the years. So some of those things have been distributed switches, Datastore clusters. So the point of the Darga release, we really wanted to try to get the VMware provider up to some of the newer things that VMware's added. And then also behind the scenes, we have some good enhancements that really help out when you have larger inventories and some other complex deployment types. So, as for features in the Darga release, probably the top build one would be more full support for distributed switches. A little bit of background about distributed switches. They really came around fixing a problem where originally you had maybe 2, 3, 4 hosts, and to connect VMs on a virtual network to your physical network, they have to go through a port group and a switch. And those two were per host. And in those places, you configure the typical networking items like MTU size, bandwidth shaping, and you had to try to keep those in common on every host. In order to do vMotion across hosts, you needed to make sure that those items were all identical, otherwise things would fail. So as things grew more popular, the number of hosts increased, the configuration overhead on the virtualization admin really increased with it. As you went to 20, 30, 40, 100 hosts, you had to make sure everything was identical on all those switches. And so VMware came out with a distributed switch. What that did was move the configuration to a single place so that all the hosts, instead of having the configuration on the host, the NICs would be added into the distributed switch. All those VMs would share that same switch and the same port group or LAN. So anything that you wanted to configure, like MTU size, bandwidth shaping, you could do it in a single place. So ManageIQ supported this. VMware added that maybe 2009. ManageIQ supported it with a temporary workaround starting in 2010, where provisioning would go during the provisioning workflow, ask the virtual center for a list of these LANs and Divi switches, and it would show you that in the provisioning dialog, and you could provision a VM to a Divi port group that way. This worked really well unless you had some networking issues, like if you had multiple workers. The worker that's going to actually be doing the provision to the VC might not be the one that you're doing the provision request from. So you could run into networking issues if one's in a DMZ and it can't communicate with the VC, things would hang. You'd have to disable it. You couldn't provision to a Divi switch that way. Also, in order to mitigate problems where talking to the VC was slow, all of those Divi switches and LANs were cached in the session. And if you had enough port groups and switches, it would overflow the size of the session and things would crash. And so it worked. There were some known limitations to it. And in Darga, what we did was add support for the new types. They were added in 4.0 of vSphere. Added those into our VMware Web Services gem. We updated the switch model. So where before the switches model was one-to-one with the host, now it's many-to-many. So multiple hosts can be associated with multiple switches. And that created our new host switch model, where we got to have fun with how to name join models. And that tracked the associations, which hosts belong to which switches. What that allowed us to do is now you can actually, along with typical port groups, you can see the Divi switches and the Divi port groups on the UI. So if you go to the host under the networking section, you can see all of the distributed virtual port groups and all the VMs that they're on. And now in the provisioning dialog, you can pick these, and this looks very similar to what it did before, but now we don't have to go out to the VC to get that information, cache it. This is all in the database. Yes?
Hello? In the past, ManageIQ would prefix all of the port group names with VDS underscore, is that, or DVS underscore,
Mm-hmm.
Is that still the case then? Or?
It is still the case. So for backwards compatibility, we still have to do that.
Okay.
I know we're in talks with Greg McCullough to try to figure out if we can move away from that, but people would have to update their automate model. So we're maintaining that for probably the indefinite future. We'd like to not have to rely on that. And there are a couple other things that we'd like to extend in the automate model to be able to track more information about those port groups as we start to extend the functionality. And so that's probably going to be hopefully something that we'll include. Good question, though. So we have our first demo showing the Divi Switch support. So this is the web services client. You can see here we have 2 Divi switches and a set of Divi port groups. Now if we go over to ManageIQ, you can check out the host. And if we go down to the network section, this is where you typically would only see standard port groups. And here you have Divi switches and distributed port groups. And we can see the VMs that are on those port groups. Now, if we go and provision a VM, pick my rel template. And enter the standard information here. Call it prov demo. And just to make sure I know it goes to the right data center, I'll set these instead of choosing automatically. And this will double as the storage cluster demo. And here's the exciting part. Now this list of port groups has come from the database, so it looks similar, but if you had any issues with networking or caching, that is going to greatly reduce the trouble that you have. So now we've submitted the provision request. And it was approved, and it's going to go through the several automate steps. And automation starting. Doing something with Active Directory. And now it's creating the VM. So we should be able to go over to the vSphere web client and see the clone task. And there it is, it was finished. For time's sake, I'm not very good at video editing, so I gave it 0 hard drive so it would clone really quickly. And the provisioning's done, just validating it. So now we should be able to go to the port group that we provisioned it to, and you can see it there show up. And that would have kicked off an event, so we can go over to our virtual machines tab And we should be able to see the VM got created. And there it is, provision demo. And now if we go over to the host that it was created on, we should be able to see this VM show up in the network list. So now before, you could provision a VM to a port group, but you had pretty much no other insight into it. Now on the UI, you're able to see Divi port groups and the VM on there. How is it? Ah. Awesome. So that's what's in Darga. And now what are we planning on doing next, other than the e-release are coming up? As you can see, the Divi switches were shown under a host. So if you have 100 hosts with one Divi switch, they're going to be shown under each of those hosts. And that's really because legacy switches were displayed that way, and we wanted to try to get Divi switches to show up as quickly as possible. Ideally, you'd see a single page and a good summary page for a distributed switch, and you'd be able to see the host under that, so we're really turning that over. In the e-release, we'd like to try to have some sort of summary page for the Divi switches and give it some summary and really report on it a little better. And I know this was brought up by Andre, one of the solution specialists, but we're going to extend the event catcher so that we can pick up on new Divi port groups. This is a workflow that some software-defined data center tools like NSX and vCloud will do. They'll create Divi port groups on the fly, and so as you're doing provisioning, they would like to be able to pick up in the event catcher when a new Divi port group was created. That way that they can provision to it directly as opposed to having to go and kick off a full refresh. So just a couple of things that we're wanting to enhance a little bit for the next release. Another feature that was added was adding and removing disks as part of VM Reconfigure. So now in addition to CPUs and memory, and there used to be, you could add a single disk at a time as part of automate or provisioning. Now through the VM Reconfigure page, you can add multiple disks, remove multiple disks all together. You can add as many up to the maximum that VMware supports, which right now is 60. And you can control whether the disks are thin provisioned or thick provisioned, and whether they're snapshot dependent or independent, and if they're persistent or not. So basically all the qualities of a virtual disk that you could set through the web client, you can set through the VM Reconfigure page. And again, you can add multiple disks at a time, which is a nice enhancement. So now if we go to this page. So this is the reconfigure this VM page. You can see we have two disks here, a 16 gig and an 8 gig. I'm going to pretend like we didn't intend to have an 8 gig disk, and so we're going to delete that one. And then in the same request, create two new 16 gig disks. So this is a lot smoother than what you would be able to do in the past. You'd have to do it in multiple steps. Now you can do it all in one reconfigure task. VMware lets you basically pile up as much as you want in one reconfigure task, and it'll be done all together. So instead of having to chain multiple tasks, this will all be done at once. So we submitted the task, and went to queued, and the reconfigure is initiating. So now if we go over to the web client, we can see in the tasks down at the bottom, our new task here, it's 55% complete. And so we can go back here and wait for it to finish. And the reconfigure is done. So that would have kicked off an event. That'll update the VM. So now if we go back to the VM here, you can see before there were 6 devices. So we deleted one and added 2. So now you can see there are 7, and all 3 are 16 gig with a single task through the UI. So a lot cleaner than it was before. And the last feature that we'll highlight is support for Datastore clusters. This was added by VMware in 5.0, and it's paralleling what they did with compute clusters. So it's taking a number of smaller data stores, aggregating them up into a top level, and you can do storage DRS on them. So VMware won't let you overflow a single data store when there's open space on some others. It'll automate moving virtual disks around with storage vMotion to spread out the load on all of your data stores. And so what's new in Darga? We added the storage pod type, which is what VMware calls data store clusters internally. We added support to that to the web services gem. We collect them in inventory, and we added a storage cluster model, which is essentially a folder to track the relationships of data stores to data store clusters. So what that allows us to do is in the UI, we added this tree structure over here, which will show your data store clusters and what data stores are in them. And when you're doing provisioning, if you want to put a VM under a particular cluster, you can see which data store cluster that data store is in. And what are we planning on doing next? What we'd like to do is collect if storage DRS is enabled, which essentially means let VMware handle where to put the disk. Don't have the user have to pick the data store directly. So we'd like to collect if that's enabled and then change provisioning so that it knows if you need to select a particular data store or not in that dropdown. You should be able to just pick the cluster and let VMware put the disk where it thinks is best. Now wait for a couple behind the scenes changes. There are no UI for this, but a couple good enhancements. We went to paged inventory collection in the Vim broker. The way things used to be done in 4.0, you would get all inventory in a single API call. And so that was either wait for updates or retrieve properties. If you had a really large environment, that could take a really long time to come back from the server. And if it's a large enough environment, you would hit an HTTP timeout. And so there was logic in there to work around that in the 4.0 timeframe, VMware 4.0, where we would catch the exception, extend the HTTP timeout, try it again. And we would do that continuously until we had a long enough timeout to be able to get all of that inventory while not hurting you if you had, say, invalid credentials or a networking issue. We didn't want to just extend the timeout indefinitely to be able to handle this. In 4.1, what VMware did was they gave you a way to get inventory in pages. And so you could continue retrieving properties. And so what we do now is we'll get properties back in chunks of a few hundred, and we'll continue going through. And they give you a way to handle timeouts better. And so those are two extended methods, retrieve properties X and wait for updates X. Those are added in 4.1. They deprecated the older ones, and now ManageIQ is off of all deprecated VMware API calls. And we got to remove some nasty timeout loops at the same time. So this is just going through the timeout loop has been removed. That cleans the code up a little bit, and we don't have to worry about timeouts out. And that actually, on a side note, fixed a strange issue where if you hit an HTTP timeout over and over again on 5.4, the networking system would just lock up and you would stop getting events. So going to paged event collection actually fixed that when it wasn't really intending to do that, but that was a nice little side note. Now for another behind the scenes tracking issue. It's fairly common for virtual admins if you have like an ISO data store, something that you don't want users changing. You can mount it read-only to hosts. MIQ is not tracking that read-only association, and so if it were, say, the largest free space data store that you had, auto placement would try to put VMs onto that data store. It didn't realize that the host couldn't write to it, and sometimes users would just pick it accidentally. So what we did in Darga is we now track the mount info of the data store, so we know how each data store is mounted to the different hosts, and provisioning will not show you any data stores that a host can't write to. Same thing for auto placement. Auto placement will never put a VM on a data store that the host cannot write to any longer. So what are we planning on doing for the e-release, aside from what we already discussed, the little enhancements for the features that were added in Darga? We are going to support policy-based management, storage policies. VMware used to call these storage profiles. I think it was added in 5.1 or 5.5, but there is no public API enabled for it. It was 5.5 or 6.0, they released the SPBM, Storage Policy-Based Management SDK, that'll let you assign or create storage policies, assign policies to data stores and VMs. So what we're planning on doing is adding support for that new SDK, and we'll let you display policies that a VM has or a data store has. And hopefully we'll be able to let you select a policy when you're provisioning a VM. So you're letting VMware handle some more of the storage placement and taking some of that knowledge off the user. If you have 200 data stores, you don't really want them going through looking for the free one. So if you give it a policy, it'll put it on storage that you've already tagged. And hopefully, longer down the line, we'll allow users to create policies through MIQ, assign policies to storage, things like that. One of the exciting things is that this would be the first SDK endpoint that we would add in MIQ aside from Vim. So Vim was the original one that VMware had. They've been slowly releasing additional ones. PBM is going to be the first one that MIQ will add aside from the core Vim SDK. Not sure if that's exciting for anyone else, but it is for me. And in addition to that, we're going to be adding enhanced support for vApps. So a virtual app is a way that VMware lets users assign sets of VMs to a particular application. So you might have, a database server, a web server, and a middleware server. They let you put all of those in a vApp, which is essentially a special resource pool. And today in MIQ, what we do is show vApps as resource pools with a special icon, and that's about it. So the plan for the e-release is to extend that a little bit. VMware lets you do power operations on vApps as a group. You can specify the order that different VMs within the vApp are powered on and powered off. And so we'd like to add power operations to virtual apps. We're hoping we can clone them. And you can also provision vApps. You can create a vApp and move VMs into it, and so that's something we might consider for maybe not the e-release, but soon after. And in addition to those, the enhanced features that we talked about before. So better summary screens for distributed virtual switches, and some enhancements for data store clusters are planned. And that's it. Any questions? And you already have the mic.
All right, I got two. One is, are you going to add the network provider to the, under the network section for the topology? Is that in the plans?
So currently that's really, Greg B described it as it's very cloudy. So we're not sure how that applies to infrastructure network managers. It's going to take a bit of planning to decide if we want to try to extend the existing cloud manager to include some virtual networking, or if we're going to make that just a cloud networking part and add an infrastructure networking part. And then on the side is always NSX. We're going to try to add support for NSX, in the future. Maybe that fits better into networking. But it's something we're looking at. It's a possibility for where we might show those distributed switches. Something that we have to plan out. But it's something that's on our radar.
Okay. The next one is you didn't mention anything about the new Ruby gem, RBV MOMI. We've gone back and forth with this for like 5-6 years now. Mm-hmm. And I see that it's in Darga. So is it here to stay, or are they going to pull the plug? What's?
It's in Darga. It must be used by someone else. We're actually been talking about moving to that, particularly because they already have the SDK created for storage policy management. Yep. So in the long run, what we'd like to do is get away from the hand soap pre-generated API that we generated from the WSDLs for their SDK, and move to something that VMware distributes as an SDK binding. And RBVMOMI is definitely one that we're looking at and playing around with. and we would like to move to that because it'd be supported by somebody else. I'm pretty sure that we have our own fork of hand soap that we extended, so trying to get off that would always be good.
Right.
And it's something that we're hoping to move to for the actual VMware Web Services stuff.
That'd be awesome.
Yeah, agreed.
Thanks.
Anything else? All right, thanks guys.